It's impressive how many different rifle cartridges there are to choose from these days. No matter what you're doing, you have dozens of suitable chamberings to choose from, and ammo companies and wildcatters are always coming up with new ones. Shotguns stand in stark contrast to this. The number of gauges in common use has only decreased over the years, and now there's just a handful of bore sizes to choose from, most of which have fairly well-established niches. This makes selecting a chambering and finding ammunition for your shotgun quite an easy matter compared to most other long guns. However, there is one wrinkle here, the matter of shell length. Unlike most modern rifle chamberings, shot shells of the same gauge come in a variety of different lengths, and most shotguns are able to accept multiple shell lengths. If you're getting into shotguns, it's important to understand what shell length is, what lengths are available in your gauge, and what lengths your shotgun can and cannot handle. Let's get one very important distinction out of the way right off the bat. A shell's length refers to its overall length in its fired state. This can cause some confusion since the mouths of shot shells are usually folded or rolled over, a process called crimping, in order to contain the payload. Crimping a shot shell results in a shorter overall length prior to firing, though exactly how much shorter varies depending on the nature of the crimp. While unfired length and crimp types are worth discussing, and will be discussed in another video, it's the unfolded or fired length that's a standard length measurement for shot shells. It's what the number printed on the shell or packaging is referring to, and when someone mentions the shell's length, they almost always mean the fired length. The reason for this is that a shot shell's payload needs to have an unrestricted path as it moves out of the mouth of the hole, through the forcing cone, and into the barrel's bore. Whatever its crimp length is, if the shell is longer than the chamber in its open, unfolded state, the end of the hole will extend into the forcing cone and create a constriction that the payload is forced to squeeze through. Shot shells have relatively low peak pressure limits and use fast-burning propellants, so even minor obstructions like this can easily cause pressures to spike beyond what the barrel and action are designed to contain. Patterns and function will likely suffer, and repeated use of overly long shot shells can damage or even destroy a shotgun. Therefore, you should be aware of how long your shotgun's chamber is and not use any shells longer than that. But as you may have already noticed, because a shot shell can be significantly shorter when it's crimped, it may seem to fit in a chamber that's actually too short to fire it safely. So, don't assume that a shell is safe to use just because it chambers. Always confirm a barrel's actual chamber length before selecting shells for use in it. Shotgun barrels should be engraved with their chamber length somewhere. Refer to this over any markings elsewhere on the gun, as many shotgun designs allow the barrel to be easily replaced or changed. On the other hand, as you may have already known or guessed, a shell that's shorter than the chamber is not a problem because the payload still has a clear path. Like many common revolver cartridges, standard shot shells have little to no taper and headspace on the rims. So, just as a .357 Magnum revolver can also chamber and fire shorter .38 special cartridges, a shotgun with a 3-inch long chamber can also safely fire 2 3/4-inch and shorter shells. And as with Magnum and parent revolver rounds, in cases where one shot shell length has an increased maximum working pressure, it is also longer than other shells of the same bore size. So a gun built for a longer, higher pressure shell will also be strong enough for anything shorter. The fact that shotgun chambers can shoot shorter shells but not longer ones is also why fired shells will sometimes come in below their advertised length if you actually measure them. Length tolerances for shot shells allow for little, if any, extra length, but a very large amount of slop is permitted in the other direction. Therefore, ammo companies can choose to aim a little low when manufacturing holes. A slightly short hole is no problem as long as the intended payload still fits, and it's a cheap and easy way to ensure that the shell won't be over spec. Alright, but why are there different shell lengths anyway? Well, the primary reason for different length shells is to accommodate different payloads. A longer shell provides more space for heavier shot and powder charges, large pellet sizes, and/or lower density shot materials. It's worth mentioning that there's no reason a small amount of shot can't be loaded into a long shell by using a taller wad or lightweight fillers to take up the extra space. However, to use a longer shell, you need a longer, heavier chamber, and for repeating shotguns, a longer and heavier action as well. Heavy magnum loads are unnecessary for many shotgunning activities, and for guns intended for these lighter applications, shorter chambers and actions can significantly reduce bulk and weight. Thus, ammo manufacturers prefer to use shorter shells for lighter payloads, so that their product can be used in both lightweight and magnum shotguns of the same gauge. So, let's talk about what lengths are out there for the various gauges. Most of the currently used shotgun shell sizes come in just a handful of standard lengths, but there are also many less common shell lengths that you may run into. It's good to be aware of the different shell and chamber lengths and their capabilities, so that you can better choose a gun and ammo that meet your specific needs. Easily the widest variety of shell lengths have been made for the long popular 12 gauge. However, the majority of 12 gauge shot shells these days are 2 3/4 or 3 inches in length. Most current and recent production 12 gauge shotguns have either 2 3/4 inch or 3 inch chambers, though the more versatile 3 inch chambers seem to have become the standard these days. A 3 inch 12 gauge chamber will allow you to shoot shells containing anywhere from 3/4 of an ounce to 2 ounces of shot, as well as nearly any 12 gauge slug load. For most folks, this range will cover anything they would realistically need to do with a shotgun, but there's always someone who wants something bigger. The 3.5 inch 12 gauge Super Magnum provides significantly more space and a higher peak pressure limit than other 12 gauge chamberings. In anticipation of the upcoming ban on lead shot for waterfowl hunting, it was introduced in the late 1980s to provide improved performance with low-density steel shot, which was the only non-toxic option at the time. It's still commonly used for steel, but its extra space and higher pressure also allow it to launch more than 2 ounces of lead and other high-density shot for things like turkey and buckshot hunting. It can certainly be argued that such heavy payloads rarely offer enough benefit to justify their ferocious recoil, but since a 3.5 inch 12 gauge chamber will also shoot any shorter 12 gauge shells, it is undeniably an extremely versatile option, even though Super Magnum guns are generally less than ideal for applications that call for lighter loads. 2.5 inch chambered 12 gauge guns were popular for a long time, especially in Europe, and since many of these older guns are still in use, a number of companies offer a range of 2.5 inch 12 gauge shot shells. Similarly, 2 5/8 inch shells and chambers were common in the early to mid 1900s in North America. Some loads still use this length, but you'll likely have an easier time finding 2.5 inch shells, especially in the US. Other lengths have been produced specifically for unusual specialty shotguns, such as the 2 inch 12 gauge shells used in some ultralight British doubles, or the 60mm shells sized for the box magazines of the Techno Arms Mag-7. If you're interested, Ian at Forgotten Weapons recently posted a video on the Mag-7 shotgun that's worth checking out. Various other short 12 gauge shells have also been offered, but I'll talk more about short shells a little later. The once popular 10 gauge has seen a fair number of shell lengths as well, but 2 7/8 inch and 3.5 inch eventually became the two common ones. However, the former has pretty much faded from use, as the 10 gauge has long since been displaced as a general purpose bore size. If you can find them, a handful of light 2 7/8 inch 10 gauge shells are still made for use in older guns, but modern 12 gauge or 20 gauge loads can easily match or surpass the payloads in these old-fashioned low-pressure shells, while also benefiting from modern performance-boosting shotshell tech. The spacious 3.5 inch 10 gauge Magnums are about the only thing that's kept this old bore size out of obsolescence. 3.5 inch chambers are the norm for the few 10 gauge shotguns still being produced, and pretty much all 10 gauge shot shells from major manufacturers are 3.5 inch. Going back down to something more popular, the 20 gauge has seen its own share of shell and chamber lengths over the years. In the early 20th century, the standard 20 gauge shell length was 2.5 inches, but as with the 12 gauge, 2 3/4 inch and 3 inch chambers eventually became the current norm, with 3 inch chambers becoming increasingly prevalent in order to give shooters the option of slightly heavier payloads. 20 gauge shot shells are widely available in both lengths, and a number of ammo companies also still produce 2.5 inch shells for older guns with shorter chambers. With the neglected 16 gauge, you're looking at 2.5 inch or 2 3/4 inch shells these days. Either shell length can accommodate a payload range that's very nearly the equivalent of the combined 2 3/4 and 3 inch 20 gauge. 2 9/16 inch holes in chambers used to be the standard for the 16 gauge, and remained common up until the mid-20th century, but these shells are tough to find nowadays. Many 2 9/16 inch chambers can be safely lengthened to 2 3/4 inches, but some repeating shotguns might not cycle the longer shells reliably without further modifications. For these guns, 2.5 inch shells may be a better choice. Some older 16 gauge shotguns were manufactured with 3 inch chambers, and for a time, ammo manufacturers offered both loaded and empty 3 inch and 2 7/8 inch shells for use in them. However, these weren't Magnum shells intended for heavier payloads. The extra space was instead used for a longer wad column. This was apparently something of a fad at the time with the three popular mid-size bores. Some shotgunners believed that the extra wadding improved patterns by creating a better gas seal and providing more cushion for the shot. Whatever the actual benefit, the idea eventually went out of vogue, and while the 3 inch 12 and 20 gauges found success later on as Magnum chamberings, The 3-inch 16 gauge was forgotten. With the little 28 gauge, the most common chamber and shell length is 2 3/4 inches, though 2.5-inch 28 gauge holes with lighter payloads were popular very early on, and 2.5-inch shells are still being manufactured for low recoil shooting or use in older guns. 2 7/8-inch 28 gauge shells were used for heavier shot payloads in days past, but with modern propellants and components, a 2 3/4-inch 28 gauge shell can now hold up to 1 ounce of lead shot. However, 3/4 of an ounce still seems to be the sweet spot for this little shell and the lightweight guns that fire it. The idea of a 3-inch shell seems to get tossed around every so often, and a few 28 gauge shotguns have even been manufactured with anticipatory 3-inch chambers. Personally, I can't think of any good reason for a 3-inch 28 gauge. It won't fit in the 28 gauge shotguns that folks already own, and it won't do anything that the more popular 20 gauge couldn't do better. With the diminutive 410, the common shell lengths are the 2.5-inch standard and the 3-inch Magnum, though Magnum here is really only a relative term. 410 shot shells as short as 2 inches have been used in some older shotguns, as well as converted military rifles such as the Ishapur Lee Enfield conversions used in India, although those guns use shells formed from rifle cartridges, which is actually something you can do with the 410. There's another good forgotten weapons video with details and history on these Ishapurs that I'd recommend checking out. If you have a 410 with a short chamber, 2-inch shot shells are still offered by some manufacturers. Reaming out a short chamber for the more common 2.5-inch shells is often possible as well. Looking at some rarer bore sizes for a minute, shells for the now obsolete 8 gauge range from 3 inches to 4 1/4 inches in length. Loaded 8 gauge shells are neither cheap nor easy to find, but if you reload, the currently produced 3 1/4 inch industrial 8 gauge holes can be modified for use in shotguns, or you can buy 8 gauge brass cases in a variety of lengths. What limited ammo is currently manufactured for the 24 and 32 gauges seems to be mostly 2.5 inch, but I have heard of 2 3/4 and 2-inch 24 gauge shells as well. Shotguns chambered for the latter would probably require hand loads or custom ammo. In addition to what I've talked about here, plenty of other less common shell lengths have existed at one time or another for the various gauges, especially if you look back at the early days of cartridge shotguns when things were far less standardized. But even today, most shotgunners will come across unusual shell lengths, either on the internet or store shelves. As I mentioned earlier with the 12 gauge, most non-standard length shot shells manufactured these days are short shells containing light or specialty payloads. It's also fairly easy for hand loaders to cut standard holes down and load their own short shells to feed older guns or get more reloads out of a hole. Powder companies have even published load data for popular 2 3/4 inch target holes cut down to 2.5 or 2-inch lengths. When loaded with shot or slugs, these special short shells often appeal to owners of tube-fed repeating shotguns, since a reduced length can allow for a significant jump in capacity. It's an attractive idea, but repeaters designed for standard length shells can have trouble feeding or ejecting short rounds with complete reliability. This is most likely to be the case with extremely short mini shells below 2 inches in length. Less extreme short shells will often function properly, however, and while they may not double capacity, they can still provide an extra shot or two over standard length ammo. Mini shells are also marketed as having very low recoil due to their lighter than typical payloads. While not untrue, if light recoil is a primary goal, there's no reason similar light shot charges can't be loaded into shells that are long enough to function reliably. As I mentioned earlier, all that's needed is a tall wad to take up the unused space. Shells that are longer than normal are much less common than short shells, but they were and are out there. Current examples include the 3.5 inch 20 gauge developed as a dedicated slug chambering for single shot guns with rifled barrels, and the high pressure 12 gauge from Hell Wildcat that uses custom turned brass holes or blown out and re-rimmed 50 BMG rifle cases. Since they require custom-made or specially modified shotguns with long chambers, you'll rarely, if ever, see these long shells for sale in gun shops. They're almost always homemade or custom-made shells intended for very specific purposes. Well, I've talked about shell length for nearly 15 minutes at this point. If you're still awake, hopefully you have a good understanding of what shell length represents and what lengths you can safely use in your gun's chamber. If you don't have a shotgun yet, and you're watching this series to learn some basics and figure out which gauge and chamber length best meets your needs, good for you! You're going to be much better off than the vast majority of first-time shotgun buyers. Please don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have questions or feedback, or if you want to mention or discuss some older unusual shell length that I didn't include here. I'm always interested in hearing about new ones. Until next time, please shoot safely and responsibly, and help promote and protect our shooting hobby by educating others about it.